Is the principle of one country, two systems dead? I'll ask one of Hong Kong's staunchest pro-Beijing politicians. I'm Marc Lamont Hill. Also on the show, the war in Yemen was supposed to last 6 weeks, but it's been 6 years since the Saudi-led coalition launched its bombing campaign on the country, leaving untold suffering in its wake. But with reports of direct talks between Riyadh and Tehran, could an end to the conflict finally be in sight? That's our debate. But first, the jailing of 5 pro-democracy figures in Hong Kong has triggered international condemnation. Critics say it's part of China's move to eliminate all political opposition. Beijing has also overhauled the region's electoral system and imposed a vaguely worded national security law. So is there any room left for dissent in Hong Kong? And what about China's promise of universal suffrage? This week's headliner, Hong Kong Legislative Council member Regina Ip. Regina Ip, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you for having me.
In recent months, China has approved a raft of changes to Hong Kong's electoral system. The number of people directly elected to Hong Kong's legislature has been reduced to less than a quarter. The election committee, which selects the city's leader, has expanded by 300 seats, which will be picked by pro-Beijing groups. But whatever happened to Hong Kong's gradual progress toward universal suffrage as inscribed in the mini constitution?
Well, our mini constitution says that universal suffrage is the ultimate aim in the light of actual situation and in an orderly and gradual manner. You know, the developments in the past 2 decades have been far from satisfactory. Mass-based elections have returned rebel-rousers, in fact, people who are hostile to Beijing. And we cannot allow that situation to continue. In other words, the outcomes have not been good. So Beijing needs to take a close look and rewrite the rules.
And when you say,
that's what we are doing.
And when you say rewrite the rules, you're saying the gradual progress toward universal suffrage is no longer an aim?
We still have a major mass participation element. We will have 20 seats elected by universal suffrage. But the new system will allow for more meritocratic, elitist participation by people with competence and knowledge. Because in the past few years, we've been gripped by extremists who used filibuster to hold up government business, and we were unable to solve our city's problems.
There seems to be a concern, though, that some of what you're referring to as competence is actually allegiance to Beijing, and that it's not actually about competence per se. For example, anyone holding public office has to take an oath right now pledging allegiance to China, and candidates will be vetted by a committee that can unilaterally bar them because they are, quote, unpatriotic.
Competence and allegiance are 2 separate matters. Both are important. Allegiance must be guaranteed. We cannot allow our legislature or our chief executive post to be filled by people who are opposed to China, who in fact want to bring down the ruling party. You know, that is not good for Hong Kong. We are part of China. We cannot be at loggerheads with our motherland, you know. Competence is a different matter, you know. Unfortunately, universal suffrage-based elections have not been able to return people with adequate competence and knowledge really to run Hong Kong, you know. So the system has to be revised to allow more meritocratic participation.
What is the basis of being patriotic or unpatriotic? It seems to me that can become a very nebulous or slippery slope.
It's very simple. Under our law, all you need to do is to pledge allegiance to the Hong Kong SAR and to uphold the basic law, our mini constitution. You know, in 2016, our Legislative Council elections actually returned a number of young people, 20-something, who actually used language which insulted the nation when they took the oath. You know, that won't be allowed in any legislature. What we want to do is to groom a loyal opposition. You know, you can be critical of government, but you must abide by our constitution, because Hong Kong under one country, two systems can only exist if people in important positions of power abide by the constitution. You know, would the U.S. accept electing people who are opposed to your basic values, you are opposed to your constitution? You know, you wouldn't allow that, would you?
Well, it would depend on what the Constitution said, probably in the minds of many. But I think the concern, again, is what constitutes opposition. In February, authorities charged dozens of political opponents under a vaguely worded national security law imposed by China last year. They were merely planning on running for parliament and challenging the government there. So in the minds of many, opposition itself has become the crime. Opposition itself has become the national security threat.
I think that is not entirely accurate. There have only been 3 cases of people charged under national security laws. So it's not true that large numbers have been arrested or charged under the national security laws.
So let's look at a few examples. The Hong Kong government charged 47 democracy advocates with violating a national security law that prohibits, quote, conspiracy to commit subversion. Also in January, Hong Kong police arrested 53 former lawmakers and democracy proponents for allegedly violating the new national security law by participating in unofficial election primaries for the territory's legislature last year. Those are just 2 examples among many that would seem to me to be prohibitive to producing opposition.
The case you were referring to concerns a group of political activists. 47 of them were arrested in connection with organizing a plot to seize power, you know, basically to grab the majority of the seats in the legislature.
But running for office, though, let me interrupt you just for a moment, just for the sake of clarity for the audience. When you say they were attempting to seize power, you mean by running for office, not by a coup or by any kind of military intervention, right?
It is a form of coup, because the plan is when they have won the offices, they will veto everything. They are determined to veto everything, even before they have seen the fine print, so as to force the resignation of the chief executive and intervention by Beijing, leading to Western sanctions and the collapse of Hong Kong. That's the game plan. So that's a plan to subvert the government. So
the plan to veto, the plan to the action of resisting, all of this seems to be an exercise of a right that is enshrined in Basic Law 52. Article 52 of the Basic Law says that the chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region must resign if they repeatedly refuse to sign a bill passed by the Legislative Council, or if Parliament refuses repeatedly to pass a budget or any other important bill. According to Alan Leong, chairman of the pro-democracy Civic Party in Hong Kong, plans to exercise voting rights to veto the budget and eventually oblige the chief executive to step down is precisely what's enshrined in the Basic Law that I just read. There seems to be a tension or contradiction here.
It depends on whether there is a criminal intent, whether you are exercising that right in good faith to object to legislative provisions that you genuinely disapprove of, or part of a plan to overthrow the government.
Who determines whether it's in good faith or not, though? How do we determine what's in good faith?
Because they have already said they will veto everything, even before they've seen any details of the budget or any legislation from the government. The whole plan is to overthrow the government. They have said so publicly.
I got to say, it seems somewhat striking, your tone around national security, given your earlier statements. In 2016, you wrote, "I will defend academic freedom and freedom of speech. For example, Hong Kong independence should be discussed in schools." This very thing that you said you would defend is now considered criminal under a national security law.
Not necessarily, because I did discuss the issue of secession in an international school, in a well-moderated, rational debates between 2 groups of systems, 2 groups of students, you know. There's nothing wrong with that. That sort of debate will definitely not infringe national security law. You only infringe national security law if you have a criminal intent and if you are actually organizing plans, actions that would subvert the government or aim at separating Hong Kong from part of China, promoting independence or self-rule, that sort of thing. Debating self-rule or independence, whether secession is constitutionally defensible, that's not an offense. I'm happy to take part in that sort of debate anytime.
So in school right now, taking the position that Hong Kong independence is the best option is not a threat or a violation of national security, you're saying?
If it is an academic, objective debate, I don't see any problem. There's a problem only if you promote, if you tell students that independence is the only way out. We enjoy self-rule, and you organize students into unauthorized public protests, waving flags, that sort of thing.
So if I, as a student, engage in a debate as an intellectual exercise, making the case, taking the affirmative position that Hong Kong should gain independence, that's acceptable. If at the end of the debate, I walk out of the debate hall wearing a T-shirt that says, I support Hong Kong independence, I have now violated national security law. Is that a fair assessment?
I won't generalize that way. All I
What's
can
a specific?
say is
that's a specific example, though. I'm saying that in the same example you gave about the debate, I'm saying if that same person were to, at the end of the debate, wave a flag or wear a T-shirt advocating the very same position they took in the debate around Hong Kong independence, would that be a violation?
That person could be treading into quite dangerous waters, but it's not for me to say. It's for the lawyers and the police to investigate and to form a judgment.
And but
I would not encourage any young person to do that.
And if someone in the debate were to be so compelling in their academic engagement of this issue that they were persuading students to support Hong Kong independence, would they then be a threat under international security?
They could be, they could infringe the laws about incitement, because Hong Kong independence is a non-starter. It's not allowed under our laws. If they did become so impassioned that they want to encourage others to go down that path, they could be guilty of inciting independence. In other words, inciting secession.
So then, in essence, you said they can engage in the intellectual or academic exercise of debate, but only if they're not too compelling or persuasive in their argument. That doesn't seem like free speech or academic freedom.
Free speech is not absolute. If free speech is translated into organized action to encourage others to go down the independence route, that would pose a problem, won't it?
Regina, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
The term third world countries is outdated and offensive. UpFront producer Ryan Coles explains why and what we should use instead in this week's reality check.
Do you say third world when you describe impoverished countries or conditions? Well, I've got good news. Today's the day you learn that the term is offensive and outdated. For years, many historians and commentators have been screaming from the rooftops to erase the third world from our vocabulary. The phrase, however, persists.
We look like the third world. I mean, honestly, we look like the third. I mean, this is stuff that you see in another country.
It's a third world
Country.
third world country.
So what gives? Why is the term so contested? Well, for starters, it has a very specific, long-expired context. The term originated in the 1950s to map out Cold War alliances. The first world consisted of the capitalist bloc, led by the US. The second world was the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union. The third world encapsulated the non-aligned countries, which the superpowers competed to influence. So third world originated around now defunct political alliances. Today, the term is stripped of its nuance and loaded with offensive connotations. It's used to invoke images of extreme poverty, civil unrest, and crumbling infrastructure, producing a false sense of superiority as if those issues aren't happening in the so-called first world. A quick glance at several indicators shows just how unfettered from reality a first world versus third world dichotomy really is. Take income inequality. According to the World Bank, the United States is the 51st most unequal in the world. sandwiched between Djibouti and Cote d'Ivoire. Australia is 93rd, right between Romania and Syria. If you peruse the Economist Democracy Index, you'll find so-called third world countries like Uruguay, Mauritius, and Costa Rica listed under full democracy. And on the flawed democracy list, the United States, Belgium, and Italy. Or how about responses to the COVID-19 outbreak? Surely the richer, more developed countries handled it much better. Not quite. In 2020, Vietnam tallied 1,465 cases and 35 deaths. The United Kingdom, 2.4 million cases and over 73,000 deaths. Oh, and Vietnam has 30 million more people. The key takeaway here is that every country has the capacity to fail miserably in certain areas and thrive in others. If third world is demeaning, what's a suitable alternative? Some have adopted terminology like developing or low-income and middle-income countries. Others opt to divide the world between the global south and global north. Even better, just compare apples with apples. If it's education systems you want to contrast, simply stick to that. Remember, the world is not black and white, so stop dumbing it down.
Following a shaky transition in the wake of the 2011 Arab Spring, Yemen descended into conflict in 2014 when the Houthis seized control of its capital, Sana'a, eventually forcing President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi to flee to Saudi Arabia. Since then, the country has become a regional battleground, with a Saudi-led coalition, bolstered by the US, the UK, and France, intervening on behalf of Hadi's internationally recognized government. It's widely believed Iran is arming the Houthis, although Tehran continues to deny the accusation. 6 years into the conflict, Yemen is now home to the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Millions are on the brink of famine, and roughly one Yemeni child dies every 75 seconds. The UN has also warned of a deadly resurgence of COVID-19 cases. Is Yemen doomed to regional power struggles and foreign intervention? And what will it take to bring relief to the millions of people suffering? Joining me to debate this are, from Lansing, Shireen Al-Adeimi, anti-war advocate and assistant professor of education at Michigan State University, and from New York, Peter Salisbury, senior analyst for Yemen at the Crisis Group. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Peter, I want to start with you. The war in Yemen has often been described as a proxy war, with the Saudi-backed coalition bombing the country in order to curb Iranian influence. The U.S. and the U.K. have supplied weapons, and many believe that Iran continues to arm the Houthis with missiles that have been fired into Saudi Arabia. First of all, do these foreign powers have the right to be in Yemen in the first place?
Wow, that's a good question, and there's no one simple, straight answer to it. I think the right is a pretty loaded question to start with, right? So is there a legal basis for justification for the Saudi intervention? Arguably, yes, on the basis that the internationally recognized President Hadi asked them to intervene, and later the UN Security Council issued a Security Council resolution, arguably justifying retroactively their intervention. And then the Houthis, who they're fighting against, who definitely have their own agenda, a big part of their message is that they stand against foreign interference in Yemeni affairs, even though, as you say, they're widely accused and fairly credibly of having close ties with Iran. But they would see that as a partnership of equals rather than a proxy relationship where the Iranians are telling them what to do or operating them on remote control. I
was going to ask that, and maybe Shireen, you can jump in here too. One, I want you to respond to what Peter just said, but also, is it overly simplistic to frame this as a proxy war?
Yeah, I think it is simplistic. I don't think that this is a proxy war at all. Yes, the Saudis are backing the Hadi government. The UAE is backing the Hadi government, as well as the separatist rebel group in the south, the STC. Iranians are supporting the Houthis in some way, although evidence for that is not as concrete, given that the country is under blockade. But I think the question about whether they have the right to intervene, I think absolutely not. Yes, they do have legal justification under the UN, but I think if a president went rogue, essentially, and called on another power to intervene, let's say Trump called on the Russians to support him in the US, I don't think that the UN would have given him cover for that. And so I think in the case of Yemen, it's a sad story of the leadership kind of betraying the population, but I don't think anybody really has the right to intervene in a civil conflict.
Shireen, according to the UN, 16 million people in Yemen are going hungry You make an interesting distinction, though. You say they're not starving, they're being starved. Can you explain why you make that distinction and why that's politically important for us to understand?
Yeah, so Yemen, prior to the war, relied on importing up to 90% of its needs of fuel, of food, and so forth. And so this is the Middle East's poorest country prior to the war in 2015. And the war, of course, has made things much worse. But the blockade essentially restricts commercial trade, which Yemenis relied on. And this has led to most of the Yemeni population being reliant on aid. So 80% of the population right now in Yemen, that's some 24 million people out of 30 million people, rely on aid for survival. And then when that aid is weaponized against Yemenis, so we've seen, for example, the Trump administration cut USAID to northern Yemen back in the summer of 2020, or the Saudis restricting fuel entry into the country, as shown in the recent CNN investigation. These elements of the blockade, these are intentional use of food as a weapon of war. This is honestly not that different from siege warfare, where you trap people and starve them in order for them to surrender. And the Saudis have been using this tactic. And unfortunately, the Western governments, including the US, have been supporting them, if not directly, then indirectly, by not exerting the influence and pressure they have to get the Saudis to lift the blockade, and going as far as denying the existence of the blockade. So the special envoy to Yemen currently, Tim Lenderking, has denied that there is a blockade despite all of this evidence.
Peter, what do you make of that? I mean, there's clearly a blockade. Tim Lenderking has said there isn't. The port of Hodeidah is clearly a site of a blockade. How does this continue to happen? Why a lack of U.S. intervention? Why a lack of acknowledgement from the Saudi Arabian government? How is that allowed to happen? Help us make sense of this.
Sure. So, look, a big component of this war has been economic warfare from all sides, but obviously you have a big, powerful party like the Saudis, who correctly, is correct to say at the beginning of the conflict, just shut down Yemen's naval waters, and then the UN intervened, set up this verification mechanism to let goods flow into Hodeidah, and since then, anyone trying to ship goods into Hodeidah has really been subject to the whims of the coalition and of the government. And as Shireen says, since January, the coalition has effectively been stopping fuel from entering Houthi-controlled areas. We get back to these legal issues, and the argument of the coalition is, well, we're enforcing an arms embargo that's part of this 2015 Security Council resolution, and we're responding to requests from the Hadi government, Yemen's sovereign authority in the international community's eyes, who are saying, you can't let fuel go into this part of the country because the Houthis are stealing, in their view, customs revenues.
Last weekend, the Financial Times reported talks between senior Saudi and Iranian officials. The goal of those talks was to repair relations. That included discussion of Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia. Of course, the Saudis have denied the talks happened. Iran has declined to comment, but they've been confirmed by a senior Iraqi official. What would repair look like? What does a fixed relationship look like, and what effect could that have on Yemen?
Yeah, that's a really big question, and it's interesting in that we've seen sort of over the years and over the decades, we've seen the Iranians and the Saudis enter into these talks, and the Saudis, front and center of that is their national security, Houthi cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia, and they evidently want those to happen. But this is happening in the context of a much bigger set of negotiations between the US and the Iranians over JCPOA. So I'd imagine that quite a lot's going to need to happen in terms of those US-Iran talks for Saudi-Iran talks to really bear any fruit, because the Iranians, of course, will see their role in Yemen as leverage, and the Saudis will not be keen to suddenly come out as major supporters of JCPOA.
Shireen, as you pointed out, Yemen is a republic. The spirit of democracy lives deep in its history. Can you ever see the people of Yemen accepting a government put in place by an absolute monarchy like Saudi?
Absolutely not. I mean, in the north, Yemen was under, Turkish Ottoman rule, and then a kingdom came about, and there was a revolution, or sorry, like a coup against the kingdom, and they fought 8 years to ensure that the monarchy was no longer in power. And in the south, Yemen was under British occupation, and people worked really, really hard to resist colonial power in the south as well, where I'm from. And so I think that the struggle for democracy is alive and well, and it's unfortunate that we think that those Gulf monarchies, absolute monarchies, have Yemen's best interests at heart. It's the only country in that region that's not an absolute monarchy, and I do think that if they end up with a system that doesn't work for them, that isn't representative, then they're back on the streets demanding what's rightfully theirs.
Oh, well, that'll have to be the last word. Shireen, Peter, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
All right, that's our show. Up Front, we'll be back next week.